Welcome. You're watching episode 109 of Regional Wrap, pre-recorded on Sunday, 15th of October. Regional Wrap, providing the insight on the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, Saving the Murray, a fruitless waste of water, is my guest, Darren Bortoli. Darren is the Managing Director of Bortoli Wines and the third generationless family-owned renowned winemaker, which has operations in both New South Wales and Victoria. Founded by grandfather Vittorio, whom migrated to the Griffiths area of New South Wales in 1924, and subsequent generations have strived to continue and build upon his legacy. Welcome, Darren.
Yeah, good day, Bill.
Thanks for joining us. This interview was headed up on the basis of a recent announcement by the Minister of Environment that they're looking at additional flows or buybacks from growers and irrigators in New South Wales only to add more environmental flows to the Murray. There was other reason now to say this process was going to be sort of delayed for 3 years, and it's sort of been inadvertently put out by Labor that not only they're considering 450 megalitres of buybacks, but there's likely to be more, and the starting price for the buybacks or funding allocation is going to be in the order of $3 billion. Now, before we get on to that, I'd like you to give us a bit of a background of your family's business and your history, because it's a very interesting history.
Yeah, Victoria came to Australia in 1924, and the thing about 1924, Italian immigration to the US was ceased that year. So it's interesting whether the family would have ended up in the US or Australia, but thank God it was Australia. And my grandfather was always fully committed, never went back to the old country, always said that Australia was his new home. And had a sort of tough upbringing, like most immigrants did it tough, and then slowly built a thriving wine business, which his son Dean took over, and when my father passed away, I took over. So it's been going since 1928, so our 100-year celebration's coming up. So we're almost dinky-die Aussies. And one thing about the Victoria, and certainly my father as well, one thing they always put great emphasis on was water security. And so Victoria came to the region, Griffith region, when water was introduced, through the Burrinjuck scheme. It really was the first major dam in Australia, and by today's standards, quite small, but in those days, and that was all about water. That was all about water security. 1913, and we arguably even have Clancy of the Overflow buried in Griffith Cemetery, which is quite an interesting story in itself for another time, maybe. But so water was always very important in consideration. When we developed in our Yarra Valley vineyards, we put in storage, and we never ran out during the drought years. We always had enough there. So I suppose their big concern is flooding of the Yarra. So it's not the same sort of problems as we've got further inland. We've got all our wine growing areas are basically located within the Murray-Darling Basin, except for our Hunter Valley vineyard and our Yarra Valley vineyard. Everything else, all the other major vineyard areas, we've got Heathcote, King Valley, Riverina, Rutherglen, all sit within the various parts of the Murray-Darling Basin.
Prior to the 2000s, water actually was a holding by the landowners. There was, if you own land, then you had the allocations. Then I think it was in the 2000s, there was a disconnect between water allocations or licenses and landowners, and we've now got a situation where a lot of people with water licenses don't actually grow anything. Do you think that was the start of the downfall of the system?
No, I think I think that the downfall of the whole thing were assumptions made that were completely wrong, Bill. Actually, I think probably one of the great environmental outcomes was the separation of water from the land. But I do have problems with speculators owning water without any productive assets to use that water. And I think that's the biggest problem that we had. Water should be traded, but only amongst productive users. To buy water and then have no costs in terms of parking that water, that's crazy. That's not Australian.
Well, the other thing is, by reducing the amount of available water to agriculture and land users and licensees, actually drives up the value, or the cost of these water licenses and that. So there would be a number of people who would sort of rub their hands in glee. Well, the government's going to take more water out of the system and flush it down the river. That means my availability, my license, or my allocation of water is worth so much more that, and I'm not in agriculture. I'm just sitting there and selling the water to the highest bidder. That has to be fairly counterproductive for the nation.
Well, I always say it's better investment than gold, because as the price of water goes up, you don't make more water. So it really is a distorted market in terms of, as you've outlined. Technically it's a finite resource, depending on what Mother Nature does, but it's a finite resource that as you take more out of the system, the price will only ever continue to increase.
The other scary part is that's there's no real register or public register of water license holders and that. So do we really know that who actually owns all these assets, and has a vested interest in seeing the water price rise?
There's been a lack of transparency, and some argue, it's available, but you have to know how to dig, and it takes a lot of time and effort. A local member, Helen Dalton, at the state level, has been a very strong supporter of transparency in terms of water markets. And she's a big water holder and family in their own right, but she's taken, the very courageous position of, we need to see the transparency in the water market. And the crazy thing, Bill, this is in the 2007 Water Act. It's not as if, it's a legislative requirement.
The other thing that's, well, I come from North Queensland, and we've had the recent review into the Bradfield scheme, an independent review and the chairman of the panel was Ross Garno. And you got to get real independence from a guy who's the biggest advocate for climate change and all those sort of panicking situations. But it's also, to me, in the vested interest of these water holders that we don't add any more water to the system. With all due respect to the Murray-Darling Basin, your total rainfall percentage of mainland Australia is 6%. Now, North Queensland, we get 27, 28% of the national rainfall. And at times we've got plenty to spare. And it's like people say, water is in short supply. Well, not. Visionary projects are in short supply, and willingness to move water across the country is probably another problem. But we also need to identify these people who hold the license, so we can identify the people who, if they're a part of any program that prevents us making more dams and moving water to where it's needed.
Yeah, there's the more dams argument is a very provocative one, and I think, as I point out, and you'll find these figures amazing, but because I certainly did at the time, in the Murray-Darling Basin, the average rainfall amount, the average amount of rain water that falls in the basin is 530,000 gigalitres, of which only 6% of that makes its way into the waterways. That's about 32,000 gigalitres. Our combined storages, weirs, locks, everything is only 20,000 gigalitres. So when you start looking at these figures, you start getting this helicopter view. There's something fundamentally wrong with our current approach. Now, the advantage of dams, which people suddenly realised during the floods that we had last year, was they help with flood mitigation. You say, how can a dam help if it's full? Well, the thing is, you can take out the peaks, and that's what they were doing. So with the second largest rainfall flood event since 1956, and the 956 event floods in the Murray-Darling Basin, 117,000 gigalitres of water entered the Murray-Darling Basin in 56. And we only have storages, and that was thank God they just finished building Eildon Dam. That was 3,000 gigalitres. They said they'll take several years to fill. Well, that filled up that year pretty quick. So 170,000 gigalitres. Our total storage is only 120,000 gigalitres. You can see that when it rains, we can get a lot. It also shows we could be facing an absolute disaster, Bill, in the future. When you consider 3 La Nina events in a row, which happen about once every 20 years, and then what happens is those first 2 La Nina years, they saturate the groundwater, the aquifers, everything, and that third year becomes runoff. And it's potential that if you rate the 56 floods with 117,000 gigalitres, and our average, not a big rainfall, our average rainfall in the Murray-Darling Basin is 530,000 gigalitres, you can see that it can be an absolute disaster if all the conditions line up. And we have there's no forward planning on this. At least the Americans have got it. They look at these potential disasters. And one of the guys in the Murray-Darling Basin, CRC, I know from my winemaking days. We're talking about the 1862 floods in California, and it rained for the proverbial 40 days and 40 nights, and 1/3 of the state of California literally went underwater, and it sent the state of California bankrupt. It was so the flooding was so bad. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you just broke off there for a while when you're talking just after California.
Yeah, California, the 1862 floods, absolutely massive. They talk about it, the proverbial 40 days and 40 nights of rainfall, and 1/3 of the state literally went underwater, sent the state bankrupt. Well, those sort of scenarios. Are we anticipating those sort of scenarios? No, we're not. We know there's a potential disaster in Sydney. Nothing's been happening about it. They do need, even for Sydney, they need some more dams for water flood mitigation, if nothing else.
The other thing is too, the discussion about water is sometimes too much simplified by just talking about a dam here or a dam there, when water should be a network. It's not just a big storage dam. It's subsequent weirs, the whole and pond water, diversion systems to keep wetlands wet, and obviously distribution of water. But it's got to be a network thought rather than just, we've got to put a dam here or down there. So that network could also include flood mitigation dams as well, which are you can add to the system to ensure you've got that buffering when you're releasing water all the way down the system. But it's just, there's nothing visionary or wide scope. It's always crisis and then a reaction.
Yeah. Now the Snowy Mountain scheme was visionary, and it was a scheme that sort of Labor did pioneer, which is unfortunately they've forgotten their legacy, and unfortunately the coalition came on board with it. But 56, the Snowy Mountain scheme was truly visionary, and it did everything you talked about, Bill. Interlinking of dams, the ability to transfer water between different systems, the And the one that people don't talk about is hydropower. It's the simplest, easily dispatchable power source that we've got. Can be brought online very quickly. And I know there's talk about the Burrinjuck. They're talking about they've canned the Wyangla Dam, which probably fair enough is going to be very expensive. But they're talking about Chris Minns, our state government, state premier, is talking about revisiting the Burrinjuck Dam system. Now, Burrinjuck catchment is an enormous catchment, and that dam, as I said earlier, was one of the first dams, was the first major dam built, but that's only 1,000 gigalitres, and there's potential to take that up to several thousand gigalitres. I imagine they'll probably compromise around 2,000 to 3,000 gigalitres. But I'm told hydropower alone will pay for that system.
I think the other thing there is we've gone from, I can go back to the 1800s when John Forrest borrowed £2.5 million, which is equivalent to $40 billion to build 2 dams in Perth, 500 kilometres of pipeline and 4 pumping stations to get water to the goldfields. Now that infrastructure is still there. It's paid for itself multiple times over and is still servicing the goldfields that's still producing gold and volumes of nickel. We've gone from that sort of visionary to the visionary of the Snowy Rivers, Snowy Mountain scheme. Now we've got politicians who are just in an election cycle. They want something quick so that they can cut the ribbon during their term of office. And this long-term planning seems to have gone out the window.
Yeah, no, unfortunately it doesn't exist. But like when you start looking at all the different parts of it, the flood mitigation, the water security, the cheap hydropower that can be part of it, using the water as a battery to be able to pump back upstream, which always looks crazy. We spend all this money trying to do it with the Snowy Hydro, and it would have been far cheaper just to build another dam and increase our water capacity, our water security and flood mitigation capacity, and give us additional cheap hydropower. There's something fundamentally wrong with the way this country's thinking, Bill.
Of course, I mean, the $2 billion project that's turned in 5 years that's turned into a gap of $20 billion and maybe by 2030. So, these people just keep on ploughing on. They're not willing to accept their mistakes and look in alternative direction. If I just move on to the previous buybacks, and they've always been sort of supposedly environmental to get more flow down the Murray, down to the mouth of the Murray. And it seems like this next buyback is also geared to do that. Now, as I said, is adding more water to the Murray a fruitless exercise to basically try to do something that can never happen no matter how much water you flush down the Murray?
The amount of water that was required in the politics behind it all goes back to particularly the Lower Lakes and the Coorong. And I was in South Australia, would have been late-ish November 2011. So this is 12 months before the plan was put into place. And the front page of the Advertiser paper in Adelaide had that fool Professor David Payton on the front page saying, we're going to need more water. They said the 2,750 gigalitre figure was not going to be enough. He said more likely the 4,000 gigalitre figure was not going to be enough to save the Coorong. And I know the Premier, I think it was Weatherall at that stage, was sort of making sort of outlandish sort of comments as well. Now the only problem with that is the flows for the Coorong never came from the Murray-Darling Basin. So the whole thing was predicated on a massive lie. The Coorong flows came from the southeast unconfined aquifer, which basically meant all of the southeast of South Australia was wetlands. 50% was wetlands pre-European, and they gradually drained all that water. And I don't criticise them for that, just the human nature, what it is. But in the end,
But we've learned a lot about hydrology since then. That's the trouble, and we don't seem to be taking.
Well, the problem is they didn't realise the flows came from a completely different water source. Now, the stupidity of this is through the roof, Bill. So we're spending billions to achieve an objective that is unachievable because the Coorong continues to die because it's got no flows from the south. So what happens? All that organic material just falls out of the water column, the plankton of the algae, and as it falls out and then settles, it starts breaking down, and it's accumulating at the rate of 6.4 mils per year in the southern lagoon of the Coorong, and it's accumulating at 5 mils a year in the northern lagoon of the Coorong. And this document, this was just fantastic when I came across it, and it shows the Coorong's dying because there's no flushing flows coming from the south. And so whatever they're doing, they will not be able to save the Coorong unless they start using some common sense. So the Coorong continues to die. And the other thing too is that water that would supply the Coorong from the south also supplied what they call the lower lakes, which is the major body of water before discharges through the Murray mouth. Those lower lakes were basically the meeting of two different systems, and that was the southeast Uncovine aquifer, as well as the Murray-Darling system. And the thing about the southeast aquifer, because it was a series of aquifers, Uncovine aquifers or wetlands at different elevations, going all the way back to the Victorian border and dropping in levels all the way down to the coastline. So you have these multiple wetlands, all at different elevations, going down to the coast, always recharged in the middle of winter and spring. And that was supplying, it's a lot more reliable than the Murray-Darling Basin. So in the 1902, and this is a classic, so the 1902 Royal Commission, when they looked at the flows for the Murray River, because South Australia was complaining about the lower lakes becoming increasingly saline. They weren't realising it was what they were doing with the aquifer in the southeast aquifer that was leading to the lower lakes becoming increasingly saline. So the 1902 Royal Commission basically pointed out that for 6 to 7 months of the year, the riverboats could operate because the water level was greater than 4 feet. Now that means 6 to 7 months, 4 feet, means for 5 to 6 months of the year, the riverboats could not operate because the water level was less than 4 feet. And it ain't rocket science to know what it would have been like in the middle of summer. Sometimes there would have been no water entering the system from the Murray-Darling Basin. The whole system would have been completely dried, such as what we saw in 2019. If it wasn't for those storages, there would be no water in any of the creeks or rivers of the Murray-Darling Basin.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have been coloured by the mighty Murray as though it was always a permanent flow in that. But I mean, there's countless photographic evidence from the past, where they've got dry riverbeds and all the paddle steamers locked up. And farmers weren't even an issue at that time taking irrigation water. But before I just go on, I'll just show a screen. This is where we're talking about. This is the Coorong, this long stretch of water here blocked by the sandbar sort of thing. And this formation is not unique to just the South Australian. Lakes Entrance it has a fairly similar sort of system. And and what you're basically indicating.
If you go to Google Earth, just click on that. You'll be able to see what the old wetlands used to be like, because they're basically all agriculture. So the bottom left-hand screen there, yep. Just click on that.
Yep.
Now you can see all those great green bits. Now that's vegetation. They're old floodplains, waterways. It's now all intensive agriculture. And if you keep going down south, keep scrolling down to the bottom, towards Kingston and all that, you can see how all the water used to flow from the Mount Gambier, used to flow northward up those, what they're effectively called flats. So the flow of water never went to the coastline. It followed these old, basically old Coorongs, run that parallel with the existing coastline, and they all flowed northward. never discharged to the Murray Mouth, never discharged to the coastline until they hit either the Coorong or they hit Lake Albert and Lake Alexander directly from the south. So there you've got Wellington, which is where the Murray River flows into. Those, and that's one source comes in, and then you've got this far more reliable system, which is the Southeast Unconfined Aquifer. In 1840, this is classic. When you go back in history, 1840, the government did a survey of the region to the south, to the southeast of the lower lakes, Bill, and they talked about the permanent native dwellings. But what they were surprised about was the lack of permanent native, there was no native wells. And that was because water was available at what they said a trifling depth. You basically had to scratch the surface to access water. And then in 1904, the very first reports from one of the big properties in that part of the world, they talk about how the willow trees and reeds and gum trees had started dying along the shoreline of Lake Albert, and how they had to sink wells for the very first time, and that someone was too saline to use, and they had to do that for their stock. So, they were impacting the system far earlier than when the Murray-Darling Basin even started contemplating building dams. Because the only significant diversion at that stage was Goulburn Weir in 1895, and that was a weir. It wasn't a storage system. All they could do was divert water. But that's assumed there was water coming down the system, which we know was not a regular occurrence.
I think the interesting thing is too, the drainage that they've put into that south west part of South Australia, that corner, it's like any area. Once you put drainage in, you're accelerating the takeaway of water. And usually you got to try to discharge it into the ocean somewhere along the line. And it sort of immediately starts to dry out the land. Now, I was born in Perth, and I lived only about 5-6 kilometres out of town. But in the 1960s, where I lived, we were on a gravel road. There was a main connecting asphalt road, but to one side of the end of our street was a creek and open paddock, more bushland, and then the other side of Belmont Avenue that was basically still dairy land. And when we had winter, the whole ground was soggy and soaked for months and months on end. But as development happens, they put in drainage. The land becomes drier and firmer, and they start building. So, and then they, of course, the rain's caught on the roof and pumped down the stormwater, so it doesn't get into land. And it's quite surprising now that land where we used to be boggy, and that is rock hard, basically with buildings and that on it. So, how quick do you think that the development of the agricultural system in that corner and the additional drains in that started to have effect on the aquifer flow?
Well, it's quite obviously it was affecting before Federation. It was one of the problems at the beginning of Federation that was what was happening with the Murray River. But as I said, the South Australians had made a false assumption. They blamed increasing salinisation of the lower lakes when the far more reliable source was the one that had been compromised, and that was before the 20th century. But what you're saying is correct about dehydrating the landscape, and there's some smart farmers in the southeast saying, well, maybe it's not very bright to be discharging that water straight out to sea. When it's good quality water, we could be using to recharge the aquifer, because the aquifer is being compromised of having to restrict agricultural offtake because the aquifer cannot supply enough as it is. Meanwhile, they've got fresh water discharging straight out, good fresh water discharging straight out to sea. And the problem with that fresh water discharging out to sea is this document shows it's killing all the seagrasses on the coastline. Now, South Australia talks about the wonderful work they're doing with seagrasses and how they're important in terms of ecosystems and all that, but all that fresh water being discharged to the sea where it never went previously along the whole coastline through these artificial drains. And there's 5 major drains starting from the basically from Kingston, where you've got the Blackford Drain, Maria Creek Drain, and then there's three major drains further going down south until you get down past Mount Gambier. You know, some of these drains are massive. They're bigger than some of our river systems, and you're right. It's compromising the landscape. It's drying it out. They should be reusing that water to at least recharge it. And yes, if it's wet, then you've still got the existing system in place. And in the process, hopefully get a bit more water going into the Coorong from Salt Creek, like it used to be. You know, all the overland flow, all the surface flows disappeared by the 1940s into the southern lagoon of the Coorong, which then flowed north into Lake Alexandrina. That stopped. But you know, the interesting thing is, when this is how I got onto it, Bill, because when I was going through the document, this one too, this is a great report. This is the River Murray barrages by the Murray-Darling Basin Commission, and the Commission guys were the good guys. You know, they tried to do it just by common sense and decency, and just trying to build using common sense in their arguments, and they hit a brick wall, and the brick wall was South Australia. Because the South Australia could not compete, refused to accept what they were saying. And this report says those 7.6 kilometres of barrages that sustain the lower lakes as an artificial freshwater system, they have to go. And the estuary has to be reinstated. Now, you know, when they talk about ecotourism, that there's no bigger ecotourism than recreational fishermen. So it would certainly become a recreational fisherman's utopia, so to speak, because suddenly you get all the mulloway and mullet and all that sort of frequenting the lower lakes, and not the highly destructive carp that not only stink, you know, highly destructive the way they feed on the bottoms of the waterways, and it's also the major recruitment place for carp in the whole Murray-Darling Basin are the lower lakes themselves, which is bizarre. So, and that I was at a meeting just a few days, and the guys attended a Murray-Darling Basin Association meeting in Canberra, on the lower lakes only a few weeks ago, and they say even the seals won't touch the carp. They'll only go for the good fish, the mulloway and the mulletics and etc. And means so what happens? Destruction of the estuary. They've destroyed the habitat. So when they built the barrages, they destroyed 90% of the estuarine interface. They said, oh, it should be okay because the freshwater left there, the freshwater fish should offset the destruction of the. This is 1935 Fisheries Commission report, by the way. What would happen if they built the barrages? And they said the Murray cod and all that should habitat, so that might be offset the destruction of the estuarine fish. But what happened is they became full of bloody highly destructive carp, and even the seals won't touch the carp. You know, they'll go for the good fish. But that estuary is important for fish like, you know, those estuarine fish like Kingali, which are the beginning of the food chain. You know, they're, you know, and they talk about the highly endangered species like the Kingali, which is reliant on estuarine water. You know, it's only surviving this tiny pocket in the Coorong, which is stuffed. Like I said, it's Coorong's dying. Don't kid yourself. And this is the whole bizarre thing about, you know, which I find, you know, our current environment minister is the water minister, Tanya Plibersek. Tanya, the Coorong is dying. You've destroyed an estuary. What are you going to do about it?
The other thing, well, before I get back to the Coorong, is with the drainage systems that have been put in, a lot of wetlands would have disappeared as well, which is good native habitat. And you would think the environmentalists would be a little bit concerned and say, well, maybe if we look at reinstating some of this water, we can re-establish some of these wetlands, which will be good for environment and native species. But we don't seem to be able to get the people who are supposedly talking about the environment to talk about these real issues that they probably could resolve for a lot less money than buying back billions of dollars worth of water from irrigators.
Yeah, well, that's the crazy thing. All the scientists I know, and I talk to them, you know, they're good people, they're intelligent people, and they all agree with what we're talking about, Bill. And then you get, how in the hell does this plan develop in it with, you know, into such a disastrous social, economic, and environmental disaster, which it is? You know, I just can't understand it. Now, I've spoken to numerous people, the people, and it's nothing. What we're talking about is nothing new. The people that know. The only thing that might have been a bit contentious, and I think they're coming around to that, you know, agreeing as well, is that the lakes like Lake Albert flowed into Lake Alexandrina, and it was supplied by the Southeast Ungifine Aquifer. I think that's probably been a bit of a revelation, but South Australians I talked to, you know, they're well and truly over that as being the historical fact that the Lake Albert flowed into, and that's how all the historical data showed Lake Albert was a freshwater system. That's not in dispute, but it flowed into Lake Alexandrina and had nothing to do with the Murray-Darling Basin, or very little to do with it. And you know, there's no river system in Australia that does not have an estuary at the end of it, except for the Murray-Darling Basin. And we've built this artificial freshwater system that is in decline. It's a social economic disaster. And why do they do it? Because Lake Albert's only 0.9 meters deep at its natural estuarine depth, and Lake Alexandrina is at 2 meters at average depth. And when they built the barrages, they raised the water level from 0.75 to meters higher. So, you know, when you start looking at it, is the main reason for this so they can sail yachts around Lake Alexandrina? And you know, when you get and look, unbelievable, but you've got ex-Liberal premiers such as Dean Brown that was paid in excess of $800,000 for, and this is over 10 years ago, to go back to 2010, for drought advice. Now, everyone knows that that was all about buying political favours from the Liberal Party. The politics of this in South Australia are corrupt. Most of South Australians I know are fully supportive of what I'm saying, because they like to eat decent fish. You know, they had the idea of a degraded water system. And when they built, and this is the other bizarre factor. So when they built those barrages and elevated the water level, they drowned out all the mud flats, which were the primary feeding ground for the migratory water birds that used to flow to the northern hemisphere. And what people don't realise is the South Australian government in 1985, when they listed the Coorong as a reverse estuarine system and the lower lakes as an artificial elevated freshwater system, under the Ramsar Convention, as the state has just mentioned, that was all about getting the environmental groups off their backs. So you know, the South Australians used, and then people made the assumption that these Ramsar sites are locked in stone, which aren't. I know Professor Max Finlinson, and I think he would love to see the estuary return. You know, no, most people with any decency would love to see the estuary return, unless you own a yacht on Lake Alexandrina, and they're the only people that I can see that are the major benefit, are the major losers of returning the estuary back in place from an environmental point of view, from an ecotourism point of view, a recreational fishermen. The systems would be fantastic. And there's no better example of that than what they did with the Peel Harvey system in Western Australia around the Mandurah region. That system was completely degraded. Used a bit of common sense, and it's a wonderful ecosystem that exists at the moment. And I was told when the algal mats were so thick there before they did these interventions, they're up to 30 centimeters thick. The algal. You know, imagine, so when the algae eventually sank, you imagine the whole system just would have been absolutely putrid. And it's exactly the same thing that was happening with the Coorong. No flushing flows, so all the algae and plankton just drops out of the water column. And as I said, it's dropping out at the rate of 6.5 mils a year in the Southern Lagoon, 5 mils in the Northern Lagoon. And, you know, if you drive past the Coorong in summer, you can understand the Southern Lagoon, particularly, Bill, you can understand why it stinks. You know, they basically created an open sewage system. You know, this is the stupidity of what's been going on. You know, so, you know, and that's, as I said, it's a social, economic, and environmental disaster, and a bit of common sense being applied, everyone's better off, including the environment.
It still beggars belief that environmentalists, or supposedly environmentalists, are aiming to perfect an artificial man-made system rather than sort of get it back to what it was originally. Now, like you say, the flushing of the estuary area, there was water from the southeast aquifer, but there was, because there was also an opening to the seawater, and it was tidal. It also, the sea flushed that system as well.
Yeah, well, I would say, well, you've got a problem, so the system needs to be flushed, the Coorong. So, well, okay, they can't get enough fresh water into the system like they used to, which was massive amount of fresh water would enter the waterways in winter and spring. So you use ocean water in summer to flush the Coorong. The advantage of using ocean water, in my calculation, I roughly, just an estimate, would be about 400 gigalitres of water would need to be pumped. Now, 400 gigalitres of water to be pumped, running costs would probably be running, I would conservatively probably put around $4 million a year. It costs them $40 to $50 million to dredge the Murray Mouth. They wouldn't need to do it if they used natural ocean water to flush the system in summer. And there's reasons why they wouldn't do it, but when you slowly go to the issues, you tick them off, you work through them, and then you suddenly say, how could you people be so stupid as to persevere with what you're currently doing? So, this is amazing. This is amazing. As you said, the estuary would have kept the Murray Mouth open, but with the positive flow displacement coming from the ocean water being pumped in, that would keep it open. I picked up on that from a paper in this River Murray barrages paper by Professor Borman, and he talked about during the 67-68 drought, when the barrages were closed for 580 days, so 1.5 years, no flows from the Murray-Darling Basin, the whole 7.6 kilometres of barrages, all locked up during that very severe drought in 67, 68. And the Murray Mouth never closed over, Bill. And yet in 81, 82 drought, barrages only closed 180 days and the Murray Mouth closed over. And that's when I realised what was going on, because I remember from my winemakers, graduating from Roseworthy, sort of heading down to be winemakers in the southeast, they were complaining about the aquifer dropping. And it was straight away, that light bulb moment. They stuffed up the aquifer. They were already stuffing it up in 67, 68. But by the 81, 82, there was no longer ability of the aquifer to sustain flows in groundwater flows into the Coorong to keep the Murray Mouth open. So you don't need very much water to have that positive displacement. You get rid of the barrages. You would probably need to build to preserve Adelaide's water supply lock system at probably Wellington, upstream or downstream. And talking about the Murray, Wellington, there's a place further upstream called Pomputa. Now, Pomputa is quite a considerable distance up the Murray River from where Wellington is. And Pomputa is Aboriginal for where the sea ends. You just can't make this stuff up. It's unbelievable how belligerent some people have been on the in terms of. Now, one of the problems, and this is one of the issues I have, so you've got to focus on water quality. Now, water quality is the big issue. Salt's no longer a problem. It is a problem during these, well, it's not a problem because the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists, when they talked about 2 million tonnes of salt needs to be flushed, that was only the figure during those high rainfall flooding years. And I first heard this figure back in 91 when the CSIRO were giving a presentation in Griffith, and they mentioned 2 million tonnes, and that was based on the very wet 89. And I said, well, first of all, nobody's using water because it's raining all the time. Our problem was too much water. And for some reason, they continue to run with that figure. The actual figure is, in a normal year, is about 500,000 tonnes of salt goes down the system. It's all of very low salinity levels, about 400 to 500 ECUs, so well under control. And that was because of a lot of mitigation work that was started in the 1990s. So they've done, we did a fantastic job in controlling it. The problem that we have is there's effluent discharges is quite a large, that's all discharging into the river. Now, the amount of water these townships require isn't that large, but they all discharge the effluent back into the system. And the crazy thing about this, in 2007, when everyone's complaining about all the problems with the Murray-Darling Basin, the poor, the water turbidity, which also ties in with carp, The major single point of contribution, contamination, if you want to call it, of the Murray-Darling Basin was Canberra, because it's at the headways of the waterway. So you got this Canberra, and this is unbelievable. So, one of my favourite jibes was always pick on Canberra because of what they were doing. And then, only a few years ago, they said, "Oh no, we fixed up the whole system." And then they have these big rainfall events, and the system gets overwhelmed, and sewage is discharging straight back into the river. And I've got to point out, even tertiary treated sewage will still be high in nitrogen and phosphates. But you're going to love this. So they said, but that's okay because it's below where we take our water offtake for Canberra.
So, as long as they're right, don't worry.
Yeah, they're right. So this is. I always think, well, maybe they should do with what they did with the Rhine River, and you've got to have your offtakes below where you discharge into the river. It quickly gets people to fix up their systems, doesn't it? But I would say, well, some of these, the focus on approaching some of these problems has always been wrong, and the focus on water quality should have been what was driving the thinking rather than water volumes. Begin with, and you can't have the fixed numbers in a highly variable system, in the Murray-Darling Basin, which it is. And like I said, the more reliable southeast Unconfined Aquifer, the wetlands of the southeast, well, that was far more reliable. They've completely stuffed that up, so you're left with this highly variable system that now is going to do all the heavy lifting. It's impossible.
The other thing, there's a lot of people in the opposition seem to be other land users further north, sort of concerned, like if the barrages went, then there would be salinity issues in their water. Do you just see that as a legitimate thing, or is that something that we can easily get around by sort of, well, like you say, up the offtake further up the Murray and distributing it from that point rather than taking it out of further down?
Oh well, I can't understand where the powers to be, where the thinking is, because it's completely contrary to what I would have been looking at. In terms of, like I said, town sewage discharges, well, that's an easy fix. Whether it's creating wetlands for water birds, and I've got to point out the most important wetland, Ramsar wetland in Australia, is the Werribee treatment works outside of Melbourne. Now, most bird watchers would be familiar with the Werribee treatment works. It is a world-class iconic site, and that's using Melbourne's effluent to produce these, this amazing wetland. But
so you can go on tour there. I think you can even do tours of it.
Oh, you do tours. It's apparently sensational. So, just our thinking, we think Ramsar sites need to be natural. They don't, but it's all about the migratory. It was all about originally the migratory water birds. That's what it's all about. But yeah, some of the systems. Look, the Darling River has got its own problems. Okay, and I don't dismiss that. There needs to be some seriously good science and thinking put into the Darling system. The southern system, which is really the Lachlan, Murrumbidgee, the Murray, and all those rivers in Victoria, it's a very much different. It's a very much different system. And in terms of what your comments about, farmers, well, my greatest concern is farmers who with irrigation, they always had the option of selling the water and going to the Sydney or Melbourne or Gold Coast, whatever, catching up with living with where their kids are. They already have that option. The equipment suppliers, the hairdressers, the doctors, the nurses, the schools, the small businesses that require, they don't have that option. And this is one of the great travesties of what's going on. So yes, the farmers do have an option if they've got water to be able to sell out, but it destroys towns. And for this is a great Labor. When you consider what Labor used to stand for and what they're currently doing at the moment, Bill, it is beyond belief.
Yes, there doesn't seem to be a focus on development and wealth creation. It's all sort of negative, knocking down the regions in regards to, well, hey, we're too expensive to support, but they seem to forget how much we actually provide for the economy. But it's definitely an afterthought in regards to investing in regional townships.
Yeah, well, very much the case. And so, the environment's always been about humanity, always, anyhow, as that point I point out. Whatever you say, it's never been about environment. It's always been about humanity's interpretation of what they want the environment to look at. And sometimes it's completely perverse in terms of what they want and what compared to the natural state, what we have. There's plenty of examples of that, and the whole approach to the environmental management in Australia is wrong. In the very before COVID hit, unfortunately, I was involved with a group called Reconciliation Ecology, and they pointed to some basic facts, and I was well aware of it in the early days, that the damage that invasive species were doing to our native wildlife. So when the Murray-Darling Basin Plan was being put in place, they said, oh, it's all habitat destruction, and that's the reason all these species are declining. I tell you now, all of it's due to invasive species, whether it's waterways, the carp destroying the habitat. That's an example of habitat destruction, was what carp were doing, because they were feeding on the bottom, stirring up all the mud, blocking out the sunlight, which was then killing the aquatic plants. And aquatic plants are important for a food source, for oxygenating the water, for stabilizing the sediment on the bottom of the river system. Then you've also got the little mosquito fish, which not many people know about, introduced in 1925. Tiny little fish control mosquitoes, because the Murray-Darling Basin was just one big swamp, prior to all the drainage and everything that's been done, and the mosquitoes were horrific. So they introduced little fish, and it's been blamed for the near extinction of 10 native fish species and 9 native frog species. So, and then you've got cats, the damaged cats and foxes, let alone deers and pigs and everything else. But most of the mammal extinctions were probably related to introduction of cats. And then we all know about the devastation that rabbits did to the landscape before the biological controls were implemented. So what's happening and one of the examples, the good what I call the good scientists. So they had a situation in Victoria. There was a farm with high concentrations of what they call the Western Plains wanderer, which is a bird that walks, enjoys the grasslands, whatever. And it's an endangered species. So they bought the property, the Victorian government, and they locked it up to preserve it. The only problem is you've got no one controlling the cats and foxes now. So what do you think happened to the numbers that went through the floor? So this goes back to the whole basis, of understanding what you're doing, so you get the right outcomes. And this is, it's the same with forestry. They talk about, the open spaces, the grasslands, pre-European, which is, they talk about, Professor Gamble talks about the great estates of Australia, and I suppose Pascoe sort of distorted that a fair bit and left a bit of a bad taste. But the reality is Aboriginals were managing the landscape, and they did it for very good reasons. And this is a common characteristic of all old ancient civilizations, are using forestry management, because they not only want the grasslands for feed, but they would never survive a forest fire in one of Australia's fierce bushfires. I remember the bushfires in that the Black Saturday bushfires they had in Victoria back in 2009. They were telling me they're driving flat out, and the fires were keeping pace with the cars. This is the sort of the speed that these fires and these horrendous events can, how destructive they are. And so without doubt, they're trying to open up the landscape. And eucalyptus is a horrible plant in some ways, because I've got fires around properties where there was eucalyptus trees, and as soon as the fire went through, all these young saplings popped up. But the concentration of it's like a rainforest thickness. But eventually a lot of them would have died out because it's not able to compete for water. But the first thing I look at bushfires is look at the thickness of the trees. When I see this, and then a lot of these trees are very, very do not have very thick trunks. They're obviously either recently planted or what, but they're the worst ones because they're all homogeneous heights, and so when and they've got relatively thin trunks, so when fire goes through, it just blasts through them.
I think one of the things too is like you can't sort of get over the fact that they're sort of realising that the carpet are a big problem, yet they're sort of keeping the environment set up so it enhances the growth of the carp. And the other thing is, probably in the last 20 or 30 years, or maybe a bit longer, we've got a disconnect where we had a lot of people, experts, government experts in the regional areas who understood the local environment and provided good input. Now, I noticed that, especially up in Queensland, we don't no longer have those regional field offices that they've gone, decades ago, and all the science and all the analysts comes out of basically Brisbane by probably university graduates who had never done a day's work on a farm or in the bush sort of thing. Do you see that disconnect as one of the bigger problems, and how do we sort of get more local input, advice and better results?
Well, you're spot on. What you're seeing up in Queensland, same thing was happening throughout the whole of the Murray-Darling Basin. We actually had a CSIRO research station in Griffith at the stage, and they were doing work on salinity and all sorts of work, and they closed down. Unfortunately, some of those people ended up at the Productivity Commission, which is a godsend, because they seem to be the only organisation with intellectual horsepower to be able to understand things like we're talking about, Bill, because I know that they were the first government body when they came to our area to talk about the Murray-Darling Basin, the very first group that ever mentioned the 1902 Royal Commission. And I thought, well, thank God we might have a chance of getting some common sense being applied at long last. But a lot of those guys and also went on to lecture at universities or whatever. But you're spot on. There's all that wealth of intelligence has disappeared. And probably the most cutting, comment made to me in recent times by a gentleman that was actually asked to head up the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists, which he sensibly turned down. But he said, look, the problem with a lot of scientists, they're lazy, and he's spot on. If they were out in the field a bit more, they would understand. They'd have a better appreciation of the natural environment. Yeah.
I think the other thing is too, the government seem to be recruiting a lot of their bureaucrats into the environment sector, and that from people who have had experience with the World Wildlife Fund or the Australian Conservation Group or something like that. And that I don't think is helpful in regards to getting a unbiased decision-making system. When you load your bureaucracy up with people who are fervent conservationists sort of thing from those types of organisations.
Well, you do have this conflict, and talking about wetlands. I mean, when the politics of the Murray-Darling Basin were in full flight, we had the Conservation Foundation. They were talking about how 90% of the wetlands of the Murray-Darling Basin had disappeared. And some of my associates, when they sort of tracked down where that source was, it was a misquote from from Dr. Bunn, who's now on the Murray-Darling Basin Authority's board. But it was a misquote from an oral presentation he gave. And he was actually referring to at that stage, to the wetlands of the southeast of South Australia. So and yet it got a lot of coverage, and the reason they refused to pull it down because obviously it was a great line to get donations in, but it was a classic misinformation, and when they confronted there was a mistake, great difficulty, and in one of the local families, she was a writer, a poet with reasonably good, a high some international reputation, and when she raised it, she was basically ostracized by the left. But she was right. And this is quite. We talked about. We just had the voice referendum, and they talk about truth telling. Well, that's one thing I fully agree with. A bit more truth telling would be great for this country.
The other thing too is with this disconnect, do you think we're going to continue along the road of successive governments taking more water and more water off irrigators until eventually we let everything go through the Murray and nothing work, and it doesn't work? Is that what we need to get these people changed to their mind, or that because they don't seem to be willing to take any counter information or do any new assessment? They just keep taking more water and more water, putting it in the system until something happens.
Yeah. Oh, look, we're already at that stage. The Coorong's dying. That's the crazy stuff, because the flows don't coming from the south anymore.
But
so we're already at the stage. We're just watching it.
More water.
We're watching later, and they say, "Oh, we just send down more water and we'll fix it." What they're trying to do, Bill, is a primitive form of colonic irrigation. That's what they're trying to do, and it won't work. As you showed on the Google Earth map, the Coorong's a long body of water that follows the coast nearly all the way down to Kingston. And a bit of common sense, 100 kilometres of waterways tugging the hose, and people are trying to say that it came from the Murray-Darling system. And this is how I got onto Lake Albert and the southern lagoon of the Coorong. I said, well, it's impossible, because if they were dependent on the Murray-Darling Basin system, the southern lagoon should have been hypersaline. Common sense. Exactly the same argument with Lake Albert. It should have been at a natural estuarine depth. It's impossible for Lake Albert to be in fresh water if it was lying in the Murray-Darling Basin. It should have been, it should have been hypersaline as well. Probably even a salt pan after all these years with the sediment that build up that would have probably occurred. These systems are in time. The destruction of probably one of the most awesome estuaries in the country, which is the lower lakes, I just find it unbelievable. And if you're I love fish. I've got my ornamental dam, and I use that to do a bit of some bit of citizen science, as you like, because I can see that I saw the damage that the carp were doing, and as soon as I removed the carp, how the waters became almost crystal clear, and aquatic plants started establishing. And unfortunately, I didn't remove all the carp, but still the water's still pretty clear, because the high concentration of cod, Murray cod I've got in the dam, are able to keep the carp numbers at least reduced. But it certainly showed to me the damage that certain things were things like carp were doing to the system. But yeah, look, the crazy thing is the Coorong's dying. This is what I can't get over. The Coorong's dying, and doesn't matter what they say, it's dying, and that's what the science says. This is hydrological report. It's the first thing I picked up. And this report, they had difficulty finding Murray River diatoms in the Coorong. For guess what reason? Because the flows never came from the Murray River system.
One of the other things too, before all these buybacks and other issues and that, Australia used to be self-sufficient and even exported rice. Now we only basically reduce 25% of our own rice and have to import rice from Vietnam to supplement our. I think Sunrise imports some rice from Vietnam to supplement their sales. What in your region where you're growing wine, will you, if this keeps going, will you face the same dire straits as the rice growers if they cut back on water or continue on the course that they're going.
Well, there's a problem. This shows you how bizarre these arguments get. So, the environment say, while they're eating their almonds for breakfast in the morning and drinking their almond milk, almonds are a permanent plantation and they have a very high water requirement. Now, and as a variable, as opposed to these, these crops like rice or cotton or wheat or whatever, you only grow it if the water's available. So, you do even the whole logic and approach with the whole of the Murray-Darling Basin is rather perverse. So while these environmentalists are, and I don't, because the environmentalists I know are good environmentalists. They understand the science, they understand how you get good outcomes. And the last thing they do is want to compromise humanity. They want to work out systems that can work well with humanity. And then some of these systems are actually, in a lot of cases, better than the natural state, because what is the natural state in the case of a drought? The natural state is all the waterways and creeks and everything would have been dry. That's the natural state.
One of the other thing too, I notice with some of the high flows and that, you're getting a lot of damaged riverbanks, and there seems to be a general avoidance of dredging the river to get the flow through the center of the river, so it doesn't damage the banks, but that doesn't seem to be on anyone's agenda as well.
Well, the problem, Bill, is they can't physically deliver the water down the rivers, and there's very good reason, because our waterways either fluctuated from floods, i.e. overbank flows, or very low flows confined within lower sections of the river. So you never had this, what you're referring to, this bank notching and that occurring in the previous, in the natural state. The bizarre thing about this is Mother Nature has its way of coming back at people, and as these banks slump and trees start falling into the river, great habitat for Murray cod, by the way, the rivers are becoming shallower and slower flowing. And so this is, that's the reality of when you push these systems. You can push them hard for a short period of time, but eventually they start to correct, and they say, well, we've had enough. And but I always laugh, if we wanted, we should be returning more natural, more trees, dead trees in the waterways, because that alone would be slowing down the flows. And the Murray River's changed dramatically. We have the company, we sponsor a PhD student doing work on the Murray River, and what's quite obvious is the Murray River had changed substantially from the 1850s to the late 19th century. And that was for a number of reasons. The riverboat trade was a very important part of how the rivers were working. So they were dredging, blasting, and desnagging the rivers from their natural state, before the 20th century. A lot of our water laws actually go back to the gold mining period, when everyone thinks of this romantic version of gold mining in the mid 19th century as people were panning for gold. They were doing it on industrial scale. Some of the machinery they had was enormous, but they also need enormous amounts of water to be able to sluice the gold and whatever. And you had this sort of terraforming occurring in some parts of the in the landscape, because of the magnitude of what was happening as rivers were diverted, creeks were diverted. So that was very much the genesis. The gold rush was actually part of the genesis of our water laws, which were a mixture of our British law and the American law, which was basically first in, first served, and who can drill deepest wins. So I think Australia's got a pretty good. We're on the right track. It's just we've detoured, and we need to get back to common sense again.
Okay, Darren, look, we've gone over the hour, so if you'd just like to wrap up in regards to what you think should happen, basically from a political standpoint and an environmental standpoint going forward.
Well, the issues are a bit complex, and a lot of people have struggled with some of the stuff we talked about. there's actually a very good, this impact of sea discharges and sea grasses. That's actually a very good document in terms of going through the history of what happened in the southeast. So if people, they can easily download that from the internet. In terms of environmental arguments and all that, in terms of getting rid of the barrages, from June 2000, this is a great report. People are interested in the fixes. The fixes are simple. This is a crazy thing, Bill. They're simple and they're simple and they're cheap relative to what the government's trying to do. And as I said, there's the environment benefits and humanity benefits. What's wrong with this picture? It just needs a completely different mindset. And I just find it unbelievable that we're continuing on this path of tunnel vision stupidity.
Well, unfortunately, that's what we might be faced with for a little while until we suffer more problems and they change directions. But if you could provide us with those links to those reports, we'll put them up on the Facebook pages along with this episode.
Yeah, no, I can provide those. But the River Murray barrages report, that's got the reason why they need to reach the Murray Mouth by Professor Bourne, because as soon as they allow it to close over, and then you got big floods, and you get major flooding around the lower lakes. But the increased water level has also made the lower lakes themselves are becoming shallower and wider because of the elevated water levels. Exactly what's happening with the river systems. It talks about the destruction of the estuary. This is certainly a great paper as well. I just hope common sense prevails, Bill, and thank you and your team for what you're doing. It's important.
Well, unfortunately, common sense is a rarity these days. If you could just stay on the line, I want to thank you for your time, of course, today. But if you stay on the line, I'll have a little talk to you off air, but I'll just introduce next week's show. If you enjoyed today's show, please like, share, and subscribe to our Facebook page. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Now, next week, we'll be looking at the real social and community impacts and economic impacts of more water buybacks in the Murray-Darling. And we'll be talking to Helen Dalton, MP for Murray, and also Chris Brooks, Chairman of the Southern Irrigators. So we'll continue that discussion next week. Thank you very much. Join us then.